V.
Welcome back to Morning at NTV. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now we're going to be getting into a conversation. This particular week, a group of people comes to light, and that is the special interest group. Now, in our election watch conversation, according to the revised National Electoral Roadmap, the nomination of candidates for committees of village special interest groups comprising of the elderly, persons with disabilities, and the youth will be conducted from the 29th of July to the 5th of August, and then elections will take place on August 11th, 2020. A look at the special interest groups and how they're faring with the revised electoral roadmap. I am joined by Charity Ahimbisibwe, who is an observer and she's a coordinator with SEDU. Welcome to Morning at NTV.
Thank you very much, Rita, and a very good morning to every Ugandan watching us this morning.
Now, I'm also joined by Mr. Denis Omar, who is the chairperson of the People with Disabilities League of the Forum for Democratic Change, who is also an aspirant within this particular election. Welcome and morning to NTV.
Thank you, Rita. I'm glad to be here. Good morning, viewers.
Now, we'll start with you, Denis. Just give us a feel, because the nomination forms have been picked. How has it been like for you in this time?
First of all, this is a full-time activity, back-to-back events in the special interest groups, but in particular the persons with disability fraternity. Nominations in the party have been picked and returned. We have district secretaries representing our special interest groups, the persons with disability. We've had a lot of mobilization across the country, which is still ongoing. People have expressed interests right from the village level, the parish level, the sub-county to the districts. And the general feel is we are here as FDC to provide the much-needed alternatives, both at policy and legislative levels, which is why there are so many. In fact, we're about 4,000 persons with disabilities who have expressed interest within the FDC structures that have picked nominations and expressed interest. And therefore, the general feel is FDC is here to provide the much needed alternatives in the leadership structures.
All right. Now, as you mentioned, the fact that about over 4,000 people have picked up these nomination forms, you also have to take a look at, this is not the usual way business would have been conducted in this particular electoral roadmap. We had the timelines being cramped from about 4 months to under 2 months. Yes. And how has that been fun as FDC, and even just for you, preparing? You had all this time and all of a sudden you don't have that much time.
Of course, the limitations are obvious. The barriers are obvious. We have an electoral commission which is not awake to the demands, to the needs of the persons with disabilities fraternity. We have an electoral commission which has not had the necessary pre-electoral process assessments that are sensitive in nature to the disability lens. Why do I say so? We are looking at a short period of time where our candidates are not allowed to move around the country or to congregate and address the electorate. We have restrictions to the effect that we must do online campaigns, online mobilizations, digital mobilizations. And now we're saying the Electoral Commission has not paid particular attention to our interests. Why? Because the dynamisms surrounding disability are critical in nature, and particular attention must be paid to the effect that we have our colleagues in the fraternity who are hard of hearing, who are blind, who have general mobility challenges, and as such are not accessing the information on television because of the hearing impairments. They cannot read the newspapers because of the visual impairments. And these are gross challenges in as far as communication and accessibility to that effect is concerned. So we are saying our fraternity is being largely left out of these electoral processes. And most importantly, it is critical enough to note that the disability fraternity in Uganda constitutes over 6 million Ugandans, which is about 12.4% of the total population. Now, of these 6 million, more than 4 million are registered voters. Now, these registered voters is a constituency huge enough to sway the outcome of any electoral process. In the past, we've had government posturing under the guise of it is the NRM government which has brought PWDs on board. But we continue to witness a deliberate effort to leave out this particular special interest group out of the electoral processes, either because they foresee a dictation of the outcome of the electoral process, but we are demanding that the Electoral Commission comes out expressly to guide this country, to guide the voters, to sensitize the voters, to pronounce themselves on what particular steps, deliberate steps, intentional programs to address an inclusive electoral process for persons with disability. These are huge gaps so far as it is.
Now, Charity, Denis raises the huge gaps for people with disabilities, the special interest groups. As an observer, taking out just a national look at how this has been in terms of just even picking up nomination forms, how has it been?
I think it is good to hear from him himself. I want to say that the observers from the country have been sending feedback to SEDU, and we've had a lot of our feedback coming in from Amuru, from Lira, from Mbale, Kasese, and Budibujo. I'll pick on those particular ones. One of the problems they had was accessibility to the centers where they had to pick nomination forms. They had to walk long distances, and they already have a disability, and then you have to go 15 or 16 kilometers to get nomination forms. And then we also see Denis raising the issue of access to information about the process. Because you see, in an election, the most significant thing is information. You need the information. When are the nomination forms out? When are people supposed to pick? When are elections happening? While in the urban centers, we have access to radio and TV very readily. In these other areas, access to radio and TV is a bit of a problem. Somebody having to cross a river, a forest, those are people who may not access radio or TV very easily. But we must also appreciate the fact that Electoral Commission is constrained by the fact that COVID disrupted the roadmap. It wasn't a choice they made, but as soon as they got a bit of relief and could relaunch this roadmap, they did, and have tried to work within the constraint of time. The only problem is the frames are short. If you look at 2 days for campaigning, if you look at about 3 days, then you go for an election. Just how much can you tell the people around you, a whole village? Tell the village that it's me who is standing for to represent the PWDs in my village. And then you're coming from the village and have to go to the sub-county. Then you're coming from the sub-county and have to go to the district. But Denis will tell you later that for them who are coming from a national level, you have to go almost the whole country, because they have regions, and you have to look for votes within a whole region. That's going from district to district. You imagine one MP stands in just one constituency, and it's already strenuous enough. So for them, they have an experience which is almost similar to the president, that the president has to go all over the country to convince everybody to campaign and vote for him. And that is what the PWDs have to go through. They have to go all over the country to convince people to vote for them. That is a humongous assignment on their shoulders. But the time frame is also short. So I think going forward, for us, what we have tried to do as the Citizens Coalition for Electoral Democracy, we have organized stakeholder meetings. Last week on Friday, there was one that happened in Mbale between the Electoral Commission and the people with disabilities. What we were trying to do was to make them speak directly to the people who are managing the process. And they raised the issues of the sub-counties and new cities and the demands that are on them to move the long distances. And so the RDC gave ways forward in some of the places. We saw that happening in Bundibujo and in Kasese. And I think also Mbali had that consultative forum, and they managed to iron out how they could work out the process. But in terms of the voter themselves, like he talks about the 4 million, yes, the people with disabilities is 6 million in Uganda. It's a known statistic. But if you holistically look at how many of them participate in the process, sometimes it comes down to 2 million or 1 million. Where do all the other 2 or 3 million go? They are disenfranchised because They do not know the process is taking place. They do not know they can also participate. But on the whole, I am happy that there is a lot of vigilance this time round. Surprise, it is a digital election. People have to campaign using digital means, but there is the excitement and that people are out there and engaging with the process.
Now, Charity, you mentioned the fact that even before this unusual electoral roadmap, we've already seen less people participating in these special interest group elections. Do we think that we'll be seeing less people even participating now when you mention all these limitations and just even the access to information in one or another? Is it going to bring the numbers down?
Yes. If you look at all the countries that have conducted elections during COVID-19, the numbers in terms of voter turnout and participation have been low. Because even when an election is full-fledged, where you expect people to run and involve themselves in the process, they've had limitations which have failed them to participate. But now there is the actual limitations in terms of a digital campaign. The time frame is short. You know, it's like you're hurrying. You just have 1, 2, 3 days and you are voting. That means even me who was still contemplating, maybe I want to vote for Denis, or I want to vote for Rita, I want to vote, I may get confused in between. I'm wondering who exactly is standing, what do they stand for, what are the ideals, and I'm saying the information is not getting to them readily. So a bigger number of them will just not want to involve themselves in a process they do not understand altogether. So I expect lower voter turnout in that election. Unfortunately, it would have been a bit better if we already had full-fledged campaigns like voter mobilization campaigns, voter education campaigns that were in their local community spaces, using those microphones to announce, hey, you people, there is a village election, hey. But even here in Kampala, it's not happening as such. You've not had microphones running around the villages, but you've seen political party leaders, like I saw Bobby Wine, tell his people that, please, this election is happening, take part in it. And I think that is a very good move. I would have expected all political parties now to engage. FDC, roll down to the grassroots. Go to your people, tell them it is time up. We want to know how many of you are standing where. We support you. How do we support you? They have the structures. And let us see them get down to the grassroots and get the people to get involved. Because if you have the structures, you can use those structures to fan up the process.
Okay. Yeah. Now, Denis, bring you back into the conversation. You're the chairperson of the Peoples with Disability League of the FDC.
Yes.
What things perhaps have changed given the short timelines now? Because as a party, have there been any adjustments to the constitution? Are you saying that since this is unusual, what has changed when it comes to special interest groups?
Thank you, Rita. First of all, any election presents an opportunity for persons with disability to increase their participation in political and public life, where it makes them a great deal of the decision-making processes of any society on matters affecting them personally, their communities, and as a country. Allow me mention that just last week, for the first time in the history of this country, we have had persons with disability assemble under the IPOD umbrella, the Inter-Party Organ for Dialogue, a conversation we've been building over the last 1 year, that we cannot discuss capacitation of persons with disabilities in inclusive political processes without bringing on board the persons with disability. And as such, our conversations have been fruitful, and over the last 1 week, we spent the entire 4 days in Entebbe with all political party league leaders represented in that symposium, and we were discussing inclusive political processes. Now, you've asked me rightly, what has changed? Allow me address myself to a very critical issue that Charity here raised about observation. We are saying in the principle of nothing for us, without us as persons with disabilities. You cannot have people in the bedrooms make decisions without direct participation of the PWD. Why should the Electoral Commission not have PWD observers prior to the processes, during and after the processes, specifically addressing PWD inclusive political processes? That will help us address better and accessible electoral process. Then two, she says the PWD member of parliament, for example, is going to travel in a region looking for votes from district to district. This actually is expanded nationally because in the current law, which is vague and is silent on key issues, is saying the member of parliament is going to move across the entire country like a presidential aspirant. We also know that the Parliamentary Elections Amendment Act, we brought these proposals on board. Why should PWDs be discriminated, unlike any other special interest groups that have regional constituency representation? You see, I have to move across the country from district to district under these COVID-19 times, trying to reach my voters. But that said, we are being deliberate. As much as we are pushing for Electoral Commission to bring into effect normalization of a participatory electoral process, we are not holding our hands folded. We are saying either way, our people must get on board because it is critical. The leadership vacuums are huge. They are obvious. So we are saying we are doing all that is possible using our district branches to say, look here, guys, get on board, pick nomination forms. Let's reach out and participate in these processes. As much as government is saying do not meet, we are saying persons with disability in this country must come together and unite. Given the fact that we have 5 members of parliament, for example, that is meager representation. 5 members of parliament for a constituency of over 6 million Ugandans. I'll draw your attention later to something really peculiar here. The army, the military, the active military personnel constitute about 60,000 active military serving personnel, and they're represented by 10 members of parliament. We also know that the same constituency of the army has the Ministry of Defense dealing with the military affairs. They too have the Ministry of Security and Veteran Affairs. We see many of the ministers today are either retired or serving military officers. Even the president is a retired military officer. So we are saying persons with disabilities do not have equitable representation. And we are calling for proportional representation to increase the numbers of members of parliament. And these things are achievable. With a voice of over 6 million and 4 million voters, we're saying let's go to the ballot. Let us put to pressure every presidential candidate in this race to pay particular attention to the demands of the PWD fraternity. Once that is done or not done, then certainly with the mobilization that is ongoing, we have the capacity to sway the outcome of this election to a candidate that will pay attention to the demands of the PWD. I'll give you a quick example. The FDC is in its final stages of formulating their manifesto. How many manifestos have you seen in the past that have been formatted in the context that is accessible to PWDs, say in Braille formats? It's not there. But I've put to task my party leaders to say, look here, to be able to bring on board the person with disabilities that constitute more than 4 million voters, let's make our manifesto accessible to those that are blind so that they can read and relate with what FDC for example, has to offer to
That's
this
when,
fraternity.
that's when we bring you in, Charity, with the changes that are being made, say, within the Forum for Democratic Change, to actually be able to make sure that each and every person is able to actually understand what is being said, what is being sent out, and not excluding anyone. Now, the images that you had just seen earlier on are from the city center, and we'll be getting into a conversation later on. But as we continue this conversation, we'll also be looking at what's happening on the ground, and we'll be doing that with Stephen Mbide as he talks to some border riders. Now, back to the conversation here in studio, Charity. What do you have to say about that?
Denis raises a number of things to do with inclusiveness. I think that from the point of the Electoral Commission and from the broad management of the process, they have been put on pressure to try and see if they can do Braille for people, the blind people. But it's difficult because it's expensive to produce ballots, for example, by Braille. It's a very expensive process because even, Denis will tell you that even the facilities they use themselves are expensive. So in terms of government priorities, if you look at how government prioritizes its processes, sometimes they weigh in on how much can we go. So the people with disabilities, for me, I prefer to look at a situation from half full, not half empty. There is the first opportunity. There is room for them to engage. 1. 2, there is also the space for them to be elected and to appear in the House. There are limitations, massive limitations. Those we can find a way of working out. But we start with the half full, there is space. So these ones that come into the House, and the MPs have said that when they have a rallying call, when there's an issue about people with disability and they need support from the rest of the MPs, they all rally around that cause because it is an issue that is affecting the country as a whole. Anyone with disability could be your relative, or you yourself could end up with a disability. It's not an inability. It is an issue that we must be able to appreciate as people because they have rights, we have rights, we are one and the same. It can be your brother, it can be your sister, it can. So we must have a rallying call. And that's what the MPs say, that once the people with disabilities come into Parliament and there's an issue that needs a rallying call, they all rally around this call. So the idea of having 10 or 5 or 10, 20 representatives coming from one cluster wouldn't stand. And the idea of having accessible material for them is excellent. Even the training of observers and the training of polling officials should be tailored to understand the needs of this special facet. But remember that when we talk about this election, we're not only talking about PWDs, we are talking about elder persons, and we're also talking about the youth. And all of them are happening around the same time. And now the Electoral Commission is thinking, how do I then manage across the board? How do I train my officials to understand the process from the youth perspective, from the PW perspective, and from the elder person's perspective? Because that is how we structured our elections. If you also look internationally and regionally, they usually hold them at around the same time. So how do we move forward? I don't think it is possible for the 2021 process, like it has been before, to provide Braille for people like the blind people. And it's also very difficult to see how the deaf will hear from TV or radio, and this is where the campaigns are going to be. So we need a solution. And the solution is the candidates and the political parties that are coming up with flyers and information should reach out to these constituencies wherever they are situated, yes, with this information and speak to them.
Now, Charity, when you speak of solutions, I want us to get into the cost of actually, you mentioned a number of times that the Electoral Commission is constrained when it comes to the financial end of things. And also for political parties, not all will be able to do this. But we're going to be getting into that conversation on, one, the solutions and also the virtual campaigns, because how is Denis going to be able to reach his people at this point in time? We're going to get into that conversation in just a bit. For now, let's take a look at what's happening on the streets with Stephen Mbide. Over to you, Stephen. What do the streets look like today morning?
Yes, good morning to you. Right now, I'm at the clock tower.
You're watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back to Morning at NTV. We've just had a look at what is going on with the borders. They seem a bit disgruntled. Their first day back after 4 months when it comes to carrying passengers. Now, the issues such as them stopping passengers not being able to get access into the city center. But away from that conversation, we now continue with our conversation here in studio when it comes to the election watch, a look at the special interest groups. And we're still having a conversation with Mr. Denis Omar, who is the chairperson of the Persons with Disabilities League of FDC, and also Charity Ahimbisibwe, a coordinator from SEDU. Now we get into the virtual campaigns. We'll start with you, Denis. You as an aspirant, what is it looking like for you now? First of all, the timelines are quite short. Yes. So how are you able to package all that you need to do, all that you had planned for, but also what cost does it come with for you? Take us through it.
Thank you, Rita. On 29th of this very month, July, the National Electoral Commission shall be starting nominations for persons with disabilities at the village level between 29th and 5th of August. The village executives shall be nominated, after which we shall go to the parish level. The parish executive shall be elected to the sub-county. Sub-county executive shall be elected to the municipality, divisions, cities and districts. Of course, the time is not there, and government continues to insist that we pursue a digital campaign. A digital campaign in itself, we know how inaccessible this country is in as far as radio and television coverage is concerned, let alone the smartphone networks. But that said, the powers that be seem to continue to be stubborn in letting a participatory election take effect. It is important to note that more than 80% of the PWD community is living in the countrysides of this country, most of whom are living in their poverty situations, most of whom are illiterate. Illiterate leaves them unable to read or consume the digital transmission of the messages that this commission insists we should pursue. What does that mean? That immediately means that the PWD campaign strategy, once you're saying we cannot assemble, means they cannot access the campaign material. Being in the countryside, being illiterate and poor, unable to afford the TVs and the radios. And yet, even despite the government promise, the joke of the century of providing televisions and radios per village is way out of sight. What do we do then? We are mandating our coordinators across the sub-regions of this country, across the districts of this country, to make deliberate steps to reach out to the PWD community. At the end of the day, as a person with disability aspiring for National Member of Parliament, where I have to move with a team, district to district, of course, having known that during the Parliamentary Election Amendments Act, the incumbent members of Parliament did all they could to prevent amendments of that law so that we can have regional representation. Because having been in Parliament for 20 years, 25 years, they had believed that this gave them an edge in as far as running the next election is concerned, which is not true. Because after all, these incumbents have nothing else to offer to the fraternity. They are not adding value to the disability movement in this country. So we are shaping our message to inform our participants that, look here, persons with disabilities in this country deserve better. And that is the rallying call. We deserve better. We have for the longest time been settling for less or even nothing. I'll give you obvious gaps. It is the message issue, really. The person with disability special grant, for example, is limited to a maximum of 5 million. In certain districts, 3 million. Others, 2. Even up to less than £1 million per year, per group of between 5 to 15. Well, the Youth Livelihood Program, I have looked at some successful projects who are getting up to 30 million shillings, 25, 20, 15. Now, the political economy of this government is to the effect that discriminate against a PWD who is not going to rise up and fight for their rights. This is obvious discrimination. So we are shaping a message around using our voice of numbers to mobilize the PWDs to participate in this election as much as possible. Of course, the expense, much as people have assumed that it is going to be cheaper for the participants, this is expensive.
Where does the expense come in for you?
I must be on TV, for example. Take my adverts to newspapers. Buy airtime on radio. This is pretty much expensive. Not just on these medias, but also as an aspirant. I must take my team across the country, like a presidential aspirant. This is designed specifically, I think, to limit participation of the PWD. That is what we gather. And out of this previous inter-party organ for dialogue meeting, persons with disabilities have increasingly waken up to the fact that the NRM government in power, we've done an audit of as far as the protection, the preservation, the promotion, and recognition of the rights of persons with disabilities is concerned. There is a general feeling that is leaving out the PWD from direct participation, which has left us one option. It is either we fight for our space and impose our voice using our numbers, who are registered voters, to rally behind a presidential candidate who is going to listen directly and address the concerns of the PWD in their manifesto with a promise of hope, or the movement is prepared, according at least to the PWD leaders who were in the iPod meeting, the movement is prepared to unite and offer alternative leaders, even to presidential level, with the hope that our rights can be promoted.
Okay. Yes. Now, speaking of this virtual campaign, the hybrid election that the president has mentioned in one of his addresses, Charity, where do you think that the persons with disabilities, but also bringing in the other special interest groups, have not been catered for, and how can they now, because there's always time to change a few things, how can we modify what we're working with to be able to include all people within the country?
One of the areas that need to be adjusted is the offline meetings, that we will not only stick to radio and TV and digital, but we shall allow for these people to engage in small spaces, but maintaining social distancing, wearing masks, with the temperature gun and sanitizers. So we should have those small consultative meetings of about 10 to 15, 30, 50 people in a town hall. You can even sit 60 as long as there is social distancing between them. I think that is one of the areas that needs direct improvement, and it should be instituted straight away for the people with disability to allow for more participation. But the second thing is, if we focus on, for example, a blind person getting onto the booth to tick their candidate of choice, I don't know that it is Rita that is here, so I am trying to act blind now. But it's Rita I want. I have an assistant who is moving around with me, and I say, tick off Rita. Where is the guarantee for me that they've ticked Rita and not Dennis? It is not there. I just have to act on hope that this person with whom I have moved understands that for me, my right is to tick Rita. Now, because of that gap, we need to make it seem easier for that category of people, by providing them as much information as possible, so that they also feel like I have chosen, even if the person who will eventually tick for them will not tick the person they want, at least they will feel that they were involved in the process. And we need to also think about the deaf, that for them, what are their special needs? So if I am a polling assistant or a presiding official and a deaf person comes to the polling station, it's difficult to tell that they are deaf. First and foremost, they will look just normally like any one of us. And then there they are, and they don't understand what you're saying. You're shouting and saying, no, no, name here. And except they have someone to help them. That is why we have what we call assisted voting. Now, for them in their category of voting, we would know that this is a person with disability coming within the people with disability stream. But supposing I'm a person with disability and I want to be a youth MP, and I'm going through the stream of youth MPs, what options have you put for me as Electoral Commission to cater for my needs? And I think that is what we were calling for Electoral Commission to look at a bit more carefully. They need to consider them faster now and say, okay, here's a person with disabilities, they have come, they want to be a youth MP, give them a chance maybe to go ahead of the line, or if you have to move 20 sub-counties for them, we shall make sure they move 1 or 2 sub-counties and the rest of the people are brought closer to them to understand their role and their mandate. And the Electoral Commission will use its structures to facilitate them more than it would facilitate the other candidates. That would work better for them, and that would be a good solution in the interim.
Earlier we mentioned 6 million people within the living with disabilities within the country.
Yes.
When you mentioned, Charity, that's having smaller group meetings, 30 to about 20. The Electoral Commission last week said it was going to work out which numbers would actually do for these offline meetings. But what cost implications will we see? Because I believe the venue will have to be catered for by the candidate or the aspirant. So a look at the expenses from your end, Dennis, and also from your, Charity. We'll start with you, Dennis.
Thank you, Rita. Charity here seems to provide a plethora of solutions to the Electoral Commission, which indeed the Electoral Commission must consider as a matter of urgency to take up on, effective immediately. She also mentioned something really profound, that every human being alive is a candidate of disability at some point in their life, either as a result of sickness or natural factors or accident or even old age. So when we're discussing disability, it is not an alien subject. It is here with us. We are saying the Electoral Commission is mandated to make every provision necessary to have a participatory election. To confine a campaign process into controlled spaces is overly expensive in as far as hiring the venue fees is concerned, among others, of course. So as a disability fraternity, if the Electoral Commission is not ready to hold the election, then declare postponement. I'll give you an example. When we've been engaging with the Electoral Commission and calling for provision of braille ballots, tactile ballots, the Electoral Commission seems to have fronted an argument that limits this participation to the expense. They say it's very expensive to create tactile ballots for the PWD fraternity because the participants are few. But we are saying the participants are few because the Electoral Commission has not taken deliberate steps to reach out and mobilize and inform and sensitize and educate the voter, to rally them to participate in the election. So the argument that it's not financially tenable to create the necessary voting mechanisms that are accessible to all does not hold water. That said, either you go through the process of election that is participatory, really for the PWD, or else you postpone the election until when you feel sure that you're ready to hold an inclusive and participatory election.
Okay, now Charity, just to get your thoughts on it as well, the cost, what cost implication does this have? One, in terms of expenses, but also in terms of who the candidate might be that eventually ends up in these positions?
The expense is high because, like he said, you have to think about moving around your delegates. That is, you have to feed them, you have to sleep, you have to, all that is an expense on you, the candidate. But also the town hall meetings where you're going to be, you're paying for a town hall, and then you have to gather people, you have to pull in people to come and feed them and give them airtime now for the ones that will be joining by Zoom if you decide to do Zoom within your community where you will go. Also remember that the technology may not allow you because the internet may go off or on, whichever you choose to do. So there's an internet cost, there's a phone cost, there's a data cost, there's a food cost, there's a hall cost, then there is the delegates cost, all on one person, you the candidate. I think that is enormous. So the solution then should be, how do we work together as PWDs? Maybe if we are 5 or 6 candidates, how do we pool resources together and be able to meet these people at a goal as a group? And we meet people at once, or we are the youth, we organize for our town hall meeting and do it also on Zoom to allow a few who have smartphones. Those who don't have smartphones, we send them flyers. Those small flyers and posters are going to be our solution. Or we pay for a car to move around on a megaphone and announce Charity is your candidate for LC1 in this place, or is your village representative for PWD, you know, and announce on that megaphone. So we pay for one megaphone, a small car, to go around announcing. That is a good solution. It should be able to get more people involved in the process. But as to how we can get all the 4 million who are supposed to be, because I don't know that register, I have not looked at the PWD register. The Electoral Commission has not shared this register. They said they were still cleaning and doing a final touch on this register. But because the election is next week and the week after, really we should have the register by now. I don't know if the political parties got their copy of the register, but one of the reasons why you get a copy of the register is to know who is participating in this election. Is it true that there are human beings there going to participate in this election, or they are ghosts? Or if they are not ghosts, are they still eligible? Did they participate in the display and in the register itself, in the voter update process itself? So that is very important. We need that document. It will be important for us to look at that document a bit carefully, and I think when I get off from here, I'll have to ask Electoral Commission to provide that register. So we look to see how many PWDs could possibly participate in this process, because right now we are talking from a point of, we know they're supposed to be 4 million, but how many went through the update and how many are on that register? You might find there are 2 million. You might find there are 1.5 million. So the Electoral Commission would give an explanation as to why it is that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us on Morning at NTV this morning. Our conversation has been on the special interest groups comprising of the elderly, the persons with disabilities, and the youth that will be conducted from the 29th of July to the 5th of August, and elections will then take place on the 11th of August 2020. That was our conversation. I was joined by Charity Ahimbisiwe, who's a coordinator at SEDU, and also Mr. Denis Omar, who is from the Persons with Disabilities League of the Forum for Democratic Change, and who is also an aspirant. Thank you so much for joining us on Morning at NTV this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And we're going to take a short break, and we'll be coming right back with Stephen Imbide as we take a look at what's happening on the ground. Keep it Morning at NTV.